I'm here today to talk to you about a transformation that's happening all around the world. It's a transformation that's been going in fits and starts over the last 30 years, and so in some places it goes unnoticed. This transformation is both a consequence as well as a driver of urbanization. That's the link to today's theme. I'm referring to the transformation in the way that people work, and it's happening fastest in cities. I'm an economist, which, to quote one of our best, Ken Galbraith, can mean that I exist mainly to make astrology look scientific and respectable. But it also means that when it comes to urbanization and the quality of cities, I'm particularly interested in the promise of agglomeration. The word agglomeration conjures up a slightly different set of expectations in economists than it does in normal people. We excitedly anticipate things like declining production costs and network effects, increasing returns, and economies of scale. In plain English, we expect that when clustered densely together, what we call the factors of production, land, labor, talent, and capital, are going to achieve a greater productivity than just the sum of each part, and that this superior productivity will at some point become self-perpetuating, an engine of growth and development. This is about as close as economists get to waxing poetic. We're a pretty dismal and dry bunch after all. One of the best-known urban economists, Edward Glaser of Harvard University, proclaimed agglomeration to be a triumph of cities. But this triumphant outcome is by no means guaranteed. Plenty of things can get in the way. As any of you know that has spent time stuck in a taxi in the clogged roads of Mexico City, Bangkok, Sao Paulo, Jakarta, and even Manhattan, congestion can also result from urbanization and can raise the cost of doing business. Agglomeration is not automatic. Other speakers in this series have no doubt highlighted the importance of connective infrastructure, such as freight and commuter rail, bridges, roads, bicycle lanes, pedestrianized areas, sidewalks, to overcoming barriers and keeping transportation costs within and between cities low. The people of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez know better than anybody why it's important to bridge geographic, political, and cultural barriers in order to sustain and share prosperity. But I want to talk to you today about a very different sort of infrastructure. It's less visible and less tangible, but no less important. This is the policy and regulatory infrastructure, in particular, labor regulation and social protection policies. By labor regulation and social protection, I'm referring broadly to the legislated definitions of the rights and responsibilities of firms as employers, of individuals as workers, and of government as the agent of our common greater good. In the United States, as in many countries, this policy infrastructure was put in place in the late stages of the industrialization process, or during the interwar period. Think of Roosevelt's New Deal, and was fortified in the decade after the Second World War. Like home ownership, a white picket fence, and 2.4 kids, the aspirations, norms, and institutions that took hold during this period remain a powerful point of reference even today. Intended to achieve a greater balance between working people and firms, and to correct many of the market failures that economists write about, this policy infrastructure was designed to support the way that people worked back then. At the time, the common path that most people followed went directly from school, sometimes through vocational training or university, into full-time work, usually for someone else. For those who detoured off this path, there were few clear ways of rejoining. By their late teens and early 20s, most people were looking for an entry into factories and firms that would provide a long employment ladder that they could climb steadily, rung by rung. Although rarely stated explicitly, the implicit expectation, both held by workers as well as employers, was that if they worked diligently, they would remain inside of the firm and rely on what economists call internal labor markets for their career advancement. The labor regulations and social protection that societies put in place at that time supported this model fairly well. Unionization and the strength of collective bargaining agreements were based on enduring occupational categories, such as welder, machinist, service employee, cabin crew. Unemployment was a relatively rare loss for which workers and firms could pool risk in insurance schemes with the help of government. Pension plans rewarded long tenure, and the firm was assigned enormous responsibility for implementing social policy. In the United States, this is especially the case with health insurance. In other countries, the delegation of agency by governments to firms can be seen in the financing channels and the eligibility conditions and monitoring of national social security systems designed to protect people from losses associated with death, disability, and old age. But all of this rested on three foundational assumptions. The first, that most people have a single economic activity throughout their lives, a job. Second, that most people work full-time in a subordinate relationship for a firm. And third, that their occupation and employment will be stable over a long term. The relevance of this resulting policy edifice, as well as the foundations upon which it is built, are being threatened by rising tides of change. Technological innovations and automation, regional and global economic integration with production chains whose links cross vast geographic expanses, or like here in El Paso, even national borders, and population aging, which demands that we remain productive for a longer portion of our lives. And as I suggested before, these tides of change are rising fastest in our cities. We observe their impact in the day-to-day experience and perceptions of businesses and working people alike. It's less viable for firms to encourage long tenure or to explicitly offer people the security of clearly defined career progression. Digital technology and internet platforms drive down the cost of organizing production through markets of many small, specialized providers. Market-based production models of this sort look cheaper when compared to the cost of relying on large, vertically integrated, hierarchical firms. Employment disruption is becoming more frequent. People are moving within and across industries, in and out of occupational categories in far greater numbers. Career change, occupational fluidity, and holding a portfolio of incomes rather than just one full-time job is becoming the new normal for many people in setting aspirations, particularly for young people in cities. Let me bring this back to the promise of agglomeration and the threat of congestion. Cities work best when people and goods can move around easily, quickly, and at low cost. In the same spirit, agglomeration is more likely to be the outcome of urbanization if the economic factors, land, capital, labor, and talent, remain dynamic. Capital is very mobile. We don't have to worry about that so much anymore. City planning, urban design, and engineering have made enormous advances in improving connectivity, permeability, and to lower transportation costs. And more flexible zoning and planning laws can accommodate changing demands for the use of land, which would otherwise be immobile. However, prevailing labor regulation and social protection still assume the stable, mainly subordinate employment relationships of the past, and that once in a particular occupation or on a particular job ladder, few people will move to another. But in doing so, they are holding cities at a lower level of productivity than they otherwise would find. To achieve agglomeration, people that are clustered together in cities need to associate around a shared enterprise, carry out that pursuit, be free to disassociate, and to reassociate with others on the next project. In the most economically vibrant cities, San Francisco, London, New York, a working person can have several such productive associations and in several different capacities: sole trader, equity partner, employer, employee, freelancer. By defining legal roles, rights, and the responsibilities of government to citizens based on where and how a person works, labor market regulations and social protection can get in the way of this dynamic process. The current code assumes labor and talent will stay in place, which is just the sort of stagnation that can keep agglomeration from ever taking hold. And by delegating too many responsibilities for implementing social policy to employers, businesses can be burdened with unnecessary cost, and people are constrained from moving or taking on several different productive roles. In the US, we observe job lock, as individuals depend on employers for the quality of their health care. In other countries, movement can be similarly discouraged by industry-specific wage scales or pension plans, or firm-based income support schemes in the case of dismissal. In a path-breaking book, From Widgets to Digits, Employment Regulation for the Changing Workplace, Catherine Stone, a leading professor of labor law at the University of California, Los Angeles, argues that the fundamental problem is that labor regulation has not kept pace with the transformation in the way that people work. This might be less a problem in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom than in other countries where government has a heavier hand in the labor market. However, even if less acutely, the contradictions between what is written in the code and what is economically viable for businesses and how people need or indeed prefer to work are creating growing gaps in coverage that contribute to economic inequality. Anecdotal accounts of firms offering people only less than full-time employment to escape mandated worker protections. People hired and kept on as freelancers performing the same tasks and working the same hours as regular employees. And the growing discontent among many who work through digital platforms such as TaskRabbit or Uber. These are just the tip of what could be a very large iceberg. We're moving fast through the fourth industrial revolution of digital technologies and cyber-physical systems, but equipped with regulation and social protection policies that were written for the age of the mass production assembly line. The inconsistency between prevailing policies and the way that most people actually work is even greater and more problematic in the emerging market countries of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. In these countries, the labor regulation and social protection models of the industrialized economies were adopted when most people were still working on farms in rural areas, and only very few were working in factories and firms. These policies fit poorly the diverse world of work in emerging market countries. That poor fit may partly explain why so many businesses and people in these countries work beyond the reach of regulation and taxation in the so-called shadow or informal economy. Some scholars argue that imposing late industrial era labor regulation in pre-industrial economies may be a culprit for slowing down their transition out of predominantly low-value added agriculture and propelling the growth of cities that suffer more from congestion than they benefit from agglomeration. So what is the way forward? What are the labor regulations and social protection policies that will support successful cities? I argue for a new policy infrastructure built on the assumption that throughout their lives, people will work in lots of different ways, and which supports these people as they move from one productive association to the next. This shift in policy approach is needed in countries all around the world. The shift will be harder in places like France, where the labor code is longer and more prescriptive than it is in the United States. But there are common steps that need to be taken to bring this shift about. The first is to recognize that successful cities require policy action across a lot of different policy areas. Dynamic labor markets are just one ingredient of agglomeration. The second step is to scrutinize labor laws and social protection for any intended or unintended biases that favor some forms of work over others, and for possible omissions and even exclusions of new working forms from the rights and protections that we've put in place. The third step is to amend these policies, or indeed to replace them outright, so that the hand governments extend to help working people to overcome market failures is there for everyone and does not intentionally or unintentionally hold anyone back from them making their next move. This more neutral policy stance that I'm describing can sound to many like a retreat of government from intervening in the labor market. That's not the case. Effectively supporting an occupationally mobile labor force will probably entail more policy action and more public resources, not less, including in partnership with businesses and community organizations. This is an agenda for policy action mainly at the national and the state level, where responsibility for labor market regulation and social protection usually lies. But there is a role that cities can play, particularly in supporting people's moves from one productive activity to the next, offering what economists call active labor market support. These are job search assistance services, intermediation services, incubator and entrepreneurship training services, coaching and mentoring. A new policy framework can and should be set up at the national and state level, but few things beat the deep local knowledge of city leadership and community members in exploiting local assets to provide these transition support services effectively and efficiently. To borrow a metaphor from mining, the people of this borderplex region are at the coalface of globalization. The transformations in the world of work that I've talked about today are the life experience of many of you in the audience. You feel this transformation sooner and keener than other people in this country. Your choice as a community is to support dynamic working people, to harness that transformation for shared prosperity and not stand in its way. Thank you very much.